Good afternoon, class. This is 6th grade History and Geography, March 30. Oh, give me a second to adjust to that. Today is March 31st, Tuesday. I'm lagging behind on my days here. So, we had just learned about Clarence Thomas and how many minorities in America were given opportunity. Today we're going to be learning about preserving freedom in an age of big government. Though Justice Clarence Thomas clearly benefited from the advances made in the area of civil rights, he insisted that any success he had achieved was due to the help of God, his own hard work, and the help of private individuals. In other words, although government can help an individual, government is really not responsible for that individual's success or failure. Even in America, everyone, including me and you, is ultimately responsible for his or her own actions. Since 1950, American history has been marked by much individual effort and success, but it has also been a time of increased government control over people's lives. Our founding fathers believed that the role of government was to protect the life and private property of the individual and his family. But by the 1960s, some politicians were saying that the government should provide food, shelter, and other goods for large numbers of people when they should be providing it for themselves. They were actually echoing the words of communist and socialist leaders. Rather than encouraging people to be responsible for their own well-being, these politicians made many people entirely dependent on the government, gradually taking away their self-respect, initiative, and civil liberties. Why work or do anything when the government will take care of you? People could no longer make certain decisions for themselves without the heavy hand of government dictating or controlling their choices. Because money for government handouts must come from working citizens, millions of hard-working Americans faced higher taxes. Thus, private individuals had less money to invest in private business and in the nation's economic future. As you study the political events from the 1950s to the 2000s, look for ways that government policies helped or hurt the well-being of Americans. Also look for ways that the strength or weakness of American leaders in the face of communist aggression helped to strengthen or weaken communism around the world. So first, let's talk about President Eisenhower. General Dwight David Eisenhower, a commander of the Allied forces in World War II, was elected President of the United States in 1952. President Eisenhower's main goal was to ensure American economic prosperity while building up our defenses against communism. The Soviet Union had enslaved all of Eastern Europe. To prevent the spread of communism to the West, Eisenhower strengthened the military alliance of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short. And it was an alliance of Western European nations, Canada and the United States, that would stand up against communism. NATO had begun in 1949 under the presidency of Harry Truman, but it was Eisenhower that strengthened NATO and made it a major role in the eventual collapse of the communist government in the Soviet Union. Under President Eisenhower, free enterprise thrived, the economy prospered, unemployment was low, and the Americans' average income increased. Great roadways were built to link together the entire country, creating an interstate highway system. The completion of the St. Lawrence Seaway promoted close relations between the United States and Canada by opening up the Great Lakes region to ocean shipping. These government projects were built by private enterprise. The prosperity of private business also made it possible for our government to develop atomic weapons with which to protect the free world from the communist threat of the Soviet Union and China. In addition to weapons, the success of private businesses and private research supplied Eisenhower with the tax revenue and the knowledge necessary to bring the United States into the space age. Though we had been beaten into space by Russia, Eisenhower greatly invested in our space research. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA as you know it, started in 1958. Soon launched America's first satellite and put the first astronauts into space. The first American to fly in space was Alan B. Shepard Jr. in 1961. In 1962, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. In 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the surface of the moon. Much of NASA's effort was motivated by the need to strengthen American defense against communism through space-age weapons technology. But many peaceful uses, especially in computer software, were also developed. So this was during Eisenhower's time. Now let's look at John F. Kennedy and his New Frontier. When President John F. Kennedy took office in 1961, he represented the liberal members of the Democratic Party. A liberal in modern America is a person who endeavors to break away from traditional beliefs and values. Because liberals often seek freedom from personal responsibility, they believe that it is the government's responsibility to provide an individual for every everyday need. A conservative wants to preserve traditional beliefs and values. Conservatives believe that the main function of government should be to protect the nation from invaders, and that people should be able to basically handle their lives the way they see fit. American conservatives want to persevere the nation's heritage of freedom and responsibility by upholding the Constitution's original meaning and promoting traditional values. Under President Kennedy, government welfare programs were expanded. Before this time, families and churches and local friends and private charities had taken care of one another. But now, the Americans saw the government borrow more and more money to provide for people's needs. John F. Kennedy called his welfare program the New Frontier. Because it is human nature to try to get something for nothing, many people took advantage of these new government handouts. And during 1962 and 1963, the Supreme Court ruled that prayer and Bible reading in the public schools were unconstitutional, something our founding fathers would have just completely gone nuts over. The founding fathers who wrote the Constitution had great respect for both prayer and God's Word. Because of our Christian heritage, prayer and Bible reading had always been a common practice in the daily routine of most schools. The writers of the Constitution would not have approved of the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution or their disregard for our Christian heritage. Interestingly enough, though, just this week, President Trump reinstated that we have a right to prayer in schools. So we've kind of come full circle on this. The 1960s and 1970s saw many liberal court decisions, including Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion or the killing of unborn babies. Since 1959, Cuba had been under the control of communist dictator Fidel Castro. Many freedom-loving Cubans fled to the United States. And on April 17, 1961, an American-trained force of Cuban freedom fighters invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. Although those brave men had been promised United States air cover and support by John F. Kennedy, no American aid was given and the invasion was brutally crushed. President Kennedy decided that he would have to take a strong stand against communism if America was to remain strong. In October 1962, President Kennedy ordered a naval blockade around Cuba to keep the Soviet Union from shipping missiles and nuclear warheads to the island. With Cuba only 90 miles from Florida, Soviet missiles in Cuba posed a grave threat to the United States. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev at first refused to back down, and the Cuban Missile Crisis had the entire world on the brink of nuclear war. But President Kennedy remained firm, and the United States, thanks to wise military planning and economic prosperity, had a clear weapons advantage over the Soviet Union at that time. Thus, the communists were forced to stop sending nuclear weapons and even to remove the ones which were already in Cuba. In return, President Kennedy promised that no American president would ever invade Cuba and deliver it from communist control. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy and his wife Jackie visited Dallas, Texas. While traveling in a motorcade through downtown Dallas, President Kennedy was shot and killed. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson became president. So let's learn about him. President Johnson believed that education and government planning could solve our social problems. He called his social reform program the Great Society. As Congress taxed more private individuals and businesses and gave the money to local and state governments, local governments became dependent on these financial handouts. Many people looked to Washington for schools, food, housing, and medical care rather than to their families, their local communities, and private charities. People became dependent on the government to support these social programs. Because of the heavy taxes, American businesses became less competitive in their production, and money for research dwindled. President Johnson decided to make a major commitment to fighting communism in the southeast nation of South Vietnam. From 1964 to 1968, he unsuccessfully urged Congress, which was then controlled by liberal Democrats, to allow American forces to invade communist North Vietnam and launch an attack. But as in the days of General Douglas MacArthur during the Korean War, Congress once again opposed a clear military victory. Under President Johnson, some 500,000 Americans were sent to South Vietnam to defend freedom in what became officially known as the Vietnam War. Although the men of the armed forces fought bravely, they were not allowed to fight to win. Many people think, rightly, that if the military had been allowed to fight the war without government or Congress intervention, as it should have been, fewer people would have been killed and communism would have been defeated. So now that we've gone from Johnson, let's talk about Nixon. President Richard M. Nixon promised to defeat communism in South Vietnam and bring all of the American troops home. Because of pressure from a liberal Congress and his desire to befriend communist China, President Nixon pulled all American troops out in 1973, leaving the South Vietnamese helpless against the communists. By the summer of 1974, several of the president's closest advisors were found guilty of criminal charges. These advisors have been involved in an attempt to break into the Democratic National Headquarters in 1972, during Richard Nixon's campaign for re-election. Because this break-in occurred in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C., the incident became known as the Watergate Affair. And I really can't go into details on this because you could literally spend an entire college course on this event. There are so many people and so many things that were connected to it. It became evident, though, that the president had been involved in a cover-up to keep the American people from knowing about the break-in. Actually, I've got to talk about it for just a second. I'm sorry. So Richard Nixon was a very paranoid person, and one of the ways they caught him was he would record every conversation in the White House, even ones that he had with himself. And so when he had to present evidence, they found very quickly that he edited many of the tapes. And so when they got the unedited footage, though, they were able to obviously show that Nixon was very much involved. In fact, he would have been probably the first president to be successfully impeached had he not resigned. And he does this really weird thing as he leaves the White House. He's getting on the helicopter, and he kind of turns on, he does like this victory V like that. We don't really know what that was for because he had resigned in pretty much disgrace. And that happened on August 9th, 1974. And as a result, his vice president, Gerald R. Ford, becomes president. President Gerald Ford faced many challenges in his presidency. Congress, still controlled by liberal politicians, refused to cooperate with President Ford's plan to cut back on government spending and social welfare. As a result, the economy suffered. In 1975, the communists took over all of Vietnam. Soon there was a terrible bloodbath of communist-inspired murder and torture in the neighboring nation of Cambodia. Communists also took control of the country of Laos. So after Ford is President Carter. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter followed the desire of the United Nations and signed a treaty with the military dictator of Panama to surrender the Canal to Panama on December 31st, 1999. The communists assumed, however, that the United States was giving up on its protection of Central America from communism. This led to increased terrorism in El Salvador and to the Sandinista communist revolution in Nicaragua. After these failures in Central America, many nations believed that the United States was becoming a weak nation. When the anti-communist Shah of Iran was overthrown in 1979, the new revolutionary government of Iran took hostage 55 Americans from the American embassy. President Carter and Congress failed to help the Shah restore the legitimate government in Iran. President Carter also did not take the necessary military action to secure the release of the American hostages. By December 1979, the United States reached a historic low in its ability to defend freedom. The Soviet Union, perceiving our weakness, felt confident enough to invade the nation of Afghanistan. President Carter, though, did achieve a foreign policy success with the Camp David Peace Accords of 1979. He was able to get the leader of Egypt, Anwar el-Sadat, and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to agree to a peace treaty. This was the first time in 2,000 years that Jews and Arabs had officially talked together peaceably. I know this was a long section, but I really enjoy reading with you guys in 6th grade. Make sure that you review through the section on your own. And let's look on page 255 at your comprehension check 14B. I want you to make sure that you do the odd numbers only. So 1, 3, and 5. Make sure that you answer them to the best of your ability. The information's in this section. I know it's a long one, but I like to really go through these with you guys. Have a good Tuesday, and I'll make sure to see you guys on Wednesday. Bye-bye.